The city of Manchester in the mid-1990s was a place of transformation. The echoes of its industrial past were beginning to fade, making way for a modern, bustling metropolis. Yet, amidst the regeneration and the vibrant cultural scene, the city still harbored the quiet, unseen tragedies that unfold behind closed doors. In the suburbs and residential neighborhoods, life moved at a steady pace, driven by tight-knit communities and hardworking families. It is within one of these communities that we find the beginning of a story that would eventually alter the landscape of British criminal justice and forever change the way society views the insidious nature of domestic abuse. This is the story of Kelly Ann Bates, a young woman whose vibrant light was systematically extinguished, and the relentless pursuit of justice that followed in the wake of her tragic death. To understand the gravity of this case, we must first understand who Kelly Ann Bates was before she became the center of a major homicide investigation. Born in 1978, Kelly grew up in Hattersley, a residential area in Greater Manchester. By all accounts, she was a typical teenager. She was described by her family and friends as bright, trusting, and full of life. She possessed an inherent innocence and a desire to see the good in people, traits that endeared her to those who knew her but tragically made her vulnerable to manipulation. She had aspirations, dreams for her future, and a loving family that supported her. The tragedy of her story is not just in how she died, but in the systematic theft of her potential. The trajectory of Kelly's life changed irrevocably when she crossed paths with James Patterson Smith. The introduction of Smith into Kelly's life is a textbook study in the psychology of grooming and predatory behavior. Smith was in his late 40s, decades older than Kelly, who was merely 14 years old when they first met. In the realm of criminal psychology, significant age gaps in relationships involving minors are an immediate red flag, often indicating a severe power imbalance. Grooming is not a sudden event. It is a methodical, calculated process. Perpetrators like Smith do not immediately reveal their dark intentions. Instead, they present themselves as protectors, confidants, or figures of authority and stability. They identify vulnerabilities, whether it be a teenager's natural desire for independence or a need for validation, and they exploit these traits to embed themselves into the victim's life. The initial stages of their interaction likely involved Smith offering Kelly attention and gifts, creating a false sense of maturity and importance. For a young teenager, the attention of an older adult can sometimes be mistaken for respect and love. However, the true objective of a groomer is control. Once a baseline of trust is established, the perpetrator begins the critical phase of isolation. Isolation is the lifeblood of coercive control. Smith systematically began to drive a wedge between Kelly and her support network. He manipulated situations to make Kelly believe that her family did not understand her or that they were actively trying to ruin her happiness. He positioned himself as the only person who truly cared for her. As the months turned into years, Kelly's world shrank. She was gradually pulled away from her friends, her education, and ultimately, her family home. By the time she was living with Smith, the psychological trap had been fully sprung. In the study of domestic abuse, this dynamic is known as coercive control. It is a pattern of acts encompassing assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation that is used to harm, punish, or frighten the victim. The abuser micromanages the victim's everyday life, dictating where they can go, who they can see, and what they can wear. The victim is kept in a state of constant anxiety, entirely dependent on the abuser for their physical and emotional survival. In the mid-1990s, the legal system and society at large lacked the comprehensive understanding of coercive control that we have today. The subtle warning signs often went unrecognized until the psychological abuse escalated into physical violence. The escalation in this case was severe and protracted. While we will not delve into the visceral details of the physical trauma, the clinical reality is that Kelly was subjected to a sustained campaign of extreme physical abuse over a period of many weeks. This was not a single crime of passion or a sudden loss of control. It was a deliberate, calculated regime of torture and medical neglect. The psychology behind such behavior points to a perpetrator with profound, sadistic traits and a complete lack of empathy. For Smith, the infliction of pain and the absolute subjugation of another human being were the ultimate expressions of his power. The hidden nightmare came to an abrupt and chilling end on April 16, 1996. Emergency services in Manchester received a call from James Patterson Smith. His voice was remarkably calm as he reported that a young woman had drowned in his bathtub. He claimed it was a tragic accident, asserting that Kelly had slipped and fallen. This emergency call initiated a rapid response from local law enforcement and paramedics, setting in motion an investigation that would uncover one of the most harrowing crimes in British history. When first responders arrived at Smith's residence, the atmosphere was immediately tense. Police officers and medical personnel are trained to quickly assess a scene, looking for consistency between the reported event and the physical evidence. Almost immediately, the visual data contradicted Smith's narrative of an accidental drowning. The responding officers observed that Kelly had sustained fatal injuries that went far beyond what could be explained by a simple fall. Furthermore, the condition of the residence and the presence of various physical indicators raised immediate suspicions of foul play. The scene was secured, a perimeter was established, and the transition from a medical emergency to a major homicide investigation occurred within minutes. Smith was taken into custody for questioning, and the property was handed over to crime scene investigators and forensic specialists. The initial assessment of the scene by forensic teams is a delicate and meticulous process. Investigators utilize a systematic approach to document the environment exactly as it was found. They photograph the scene from multiple angles, sketch the layout of the rooms, and begin the careful collection of trace evidence. In this case, the investigators were looking for signs of a struggle, blood spatter patterns, and any objects that might have been used to inflict trauma. The forensic analysis of the home revealed a prolonged history of violence that had occurred within those walls, further dismantling Smith's claim of a sudden accident. The most critical phase of the investigation, however, took place in the mortuary. The post-mortem examination, conducted by a highly experienced forensic pathologist, is where the science of medicine meets the pursuit of justice. A forensic pathologist acts as the final physician for the deceased, translating the trauma on the body into a factual narrative of how the person died. In the case of Kellyanne Bates, the pathology report was extensive and profoundly disturbing. The clinical findings indicated that Kelly had been subjected to severe, systemic trauma over a period of at least 4 weeks prior to her death. The injuries were numerous and varied, encompassing extensive blunt force trauma, thermal injuries, and profound malnutrition. What is crucial from an educational standpoint is how a pathologist determines the timeline of such injuries. This is done through a process called histology, which is the microscopic examination of tissue. When the human body sustains an injury, it immediately begins a complex biological healing process. White blood cells rush to the site to fight infection, followed by macrophages that clear away damaged tissue, and fibroblasts that begin to lay down new collagen to form a scar. By taking microscopic samples of the injured tissues, the pathologist can observe which stage of the healing process is currently active. If an injury shows no signs of cellular response, it was likely inflicted at or very near the time of death. If there is a robust presence of fibroblasts and early scar tissue, the injury is days or weeks old. Through this precise cellular analysis, the forensic pathologist was able to definitively prove that Kelly's injuries were in various stages of healing. This scientific evidence was the cornerstone of the prosecution. It provided irrefutable proof that the trauma was not the result of a single accidental fall in a bathtub, but rather a prolonged, intentional campaign of physical abuse. Furthermore, the pathologist concluded that the ultimate cause of death was a combination of the systemic injuries and the severe medical neglect she endured while being held captive in the home. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a victim who was systematically broken down, unable to seek help or escape her captor. Armed with this overwhelming scientific evidence, detectives proceeded with the interrogation of James Patterson Smith. In the United Kingdom, police interviews are conducted using a highly structured framework known as the PEACE model. This stands for Preparation and Planning, Engage and Explain, Account, Closure, and Evaluate. Unlike the confrontational interrogation techniques, often dramatized in television and film, the PEACE model is designed to gather accurate and reliable information without relying on coercion. It is an information-gathering approach rather than a confession-seeking approach. During the preparation phase, detectives meticulously reviewed the forensic pathology report, the crime scene photographs, and the background information on both Smith and Kelly. They understood the psychological profile of the man sitting across from them. He was a manipulator who believed he could outsmart the authorities. In the engage and explain phase, the detectives established a professional, calm rapport, explaining the procedures and Smith's legal rights. The critical part of the interview is the account phase. Here, detectives allowed Smith to tell his version of events without interruption. They let him lock himself into his narrative of the accidental drowning. They asked open-ended questions, encouraging him to provide details about the timeline and his actions. Once Smith had firmly committed to his story, the detectives began the strategic presentation of evidence. This is where the trap closes. They introduced the findings of the forensic pathologist. They asked Smith to explain how a simple fall in a bathtub could account for weeks of systemic trauma, thermal injuries, and malnutrition. They presented the histological evidence proving the injuries were in various stages of healing. Faced with the cold, undeniable facts of forensic science, Smith's demeanor shifted. His attempts to explain away the evidence became increasingly contradictory and absurd. He attempted to claim that Kelly had inflicted the injuries upon herself, a defense that was immediately dismissed by medical experts as physically impossible. The detectives systematically dismantled his lies, exposing the reality of his actions through the lens of objective evidence. The Crown Prosecution Service, tasked with bringing the case to trial, recognized the monumental responsibility they held. They were not just prosecuting a murder, they were bringing to light a case of domestic abuse so extreme that it defied comprehension. The preparation for the trial was exhaustive. The prosecution team worked closely with the forensic pathologist, crime scene investigators, and psychological experts to build an impenetrable case. They understood that the defense would likely attempt to muddy the waters, perhaps by attacking the character of the victim or leaning heavily on the self-inflicted injury narrative. The trial of James Patterson Smith commenced in 1997 at the Manchester Crown Court. The courtroom is a theater of justice, governed by strict rules of evidence and procedure. The prosecution, representing the state and the victim, bore the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Smith intentionally caused the death of Kellyanne Bates. The prosecution's opening statement set a solemn and clinical tone. They guided the jury through the timeline of the relationship, detailing the grooming, the isolation, and the eventual escalation into physical captivity. The cornerstone of the trial was the expert testimony. When the forensic pathologist took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. With clinical precision, the pathologist detailed the extent of the trauma, using anatomical diagrams and histological reports to explain the science of injury dating. The expert witness calmly and methodically refuted every alternate theory proposed by the defense. They explained that the pattern, severity, and location of the injuries were entirely inconsistent with an accident or self-harm, and were the hallmark of sustained, non-accidental trauma inflicted by another person. The defense strategy was, predictably, a desperate attempt to deflect blame. Smith's legal counsel tried to argue that the injuries were the result of a tragic series of accidents and that Kelly had a propensity for self-harm. However, under the rigorous cross-examination by the prosecution, these arguments collapsed. The forensic evidence was simply too robust. Furthermore, the psychological profile of Smith was laid bare for the jury to see. He was exposed not as a misunderstood partner, but as a calculated, controlling abuser who used isolation and violence to maintain absolute dominance over a vulnerable teenager. As the trial drew to a close, the emotional toll on the jury, the legal teams, and particularly the Bates family was immense. They had been forced to listen to the clinical detailing of their daughter's final weeks. Yet, through their grief, they maintained a dignified presence, seeking the justice that Kelly deserved. The judge's instructions to the jury were clear, outlining the legal definitions of murder and the standard of proof required. The jury deliberated, weighing the overwhelming scientific evidence against the frail and contradictory claims of the defense. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdict was unanimous. James Patterson Smith was found guilty of the murder of Kelly Ann Bates. The sentencing phase provided the judge with an opportunity to address the sheer gravity of the crime. In the United Kingdom, a conviction for murder carries a mandatory life sentence, but the judge must set a minimum term to be served before the offender is eligible for parole. The judge condemned Smith's actions in the strongest possible terms, highlighting his complete lack of remorse, his predatory behavior, and the unimaginable suffering he inflicted upon a young, defenseless woman. The judge emphasized that Smith was a highly dangerous individual who posed a significant threat to the public. James Patterson Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of the power and control he so desperately craved. The gavel falling marked the end of the legal proceedings, but it was far from the end of the story. The murder of Kelly Ann Bates sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom. It forced society to confront the darkest realities of domestic abuse and the catastrophic consequences of missing the early warning signs of coercive control. For the Bates family, the verdict provided a measure of legal justice, but it could never fill the void left by the loss of their daughter. However, rather than succumbing to their grief, Kelly's parents channeled their pain into relentless advocacy. They recognized that if a tragedy of this magnitude could happen to their bright, trusting daughter, it could happen to anyone. They became vocal campaigners against domestic violence, working tirelessly to raise awareness about the dangers of grooming and the critical importance of recognizing the signs of an abusive relationship before it is too late. Their advocacy played a significant role in the broader cultural and legal shift regarding domestic abuse in the United Kingdom. For decades, domestic violence was often viewed as a private family matter, a physical altercation behind closed doors. The Kelly Ann Bates case highlighted that physical violence is often the final stage of a much longer process of psychological manipulation and control. It demonstrated the desperate need for law enforcement, social services, and the public to understand the dynamics of coercive control. This gradual shift in understanding eventually contributed to monumental changes in British law. Years later, recognizing the profound damage caused by psychological abuse, the United Kingdom enacted the Serious Crime Act of 2015. This landmark legislation officially made coercive and controlling behavior in an intimate or family relationship a criminal offense. It acknowledged what experts had known for years, that the systematic destruction of a person's autonomy, the isolation from friends and family, and the constant psychological intimidation are forms of abuse just as damaging as physical violence. While this law came too late to save Kelly, it stands as a testament to the evolving understanding of domestic abuse, an evolution driven in part by the tragic lessons learned from her case. The legacy of Kelly Ann Bates is a complex tapestry of profound tragedy and enduring impact. She is remembered not just as a victim of a horrific crime, but as a catalyst for change. Her story is a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities of youth and the deceptive nature of predatory individuals. It underscores the vital importance of community vigilance. It teaches us that abuse does not always begin with a physical blow. It often begins with a compliment, a gift, and a slow, quiet separation from the outside world. From an investigative standpoint, the case remains a hallmark of forensic excellence. It demonstrates the power of objective science to speak for those whose voices have been silenced. The meticulous work of the crime scene investigators, the precise cellular analysis by the forensic pathologist, and the strategic interviewing by detectives all combined to create an inescapable net of evidence. It proved that no matter how cunning a perpetrator believes they are, the physical evidence left behind by trauma will always tell the truth. As we reflect on the facts of this investigation, the psychological mechanisms of control, and the relentless pursuit of justice, we are left to consider our own roles within our communities. We now possess the knowledge and the legal frameworks to address coercive control that did not exist in 1996. We know the signs of isolation, the red flags of extreme age gaps, and the subtle ways abusers manipulate their victims. The justice system did its job by removing James Patterson Smith from society, but true prevention happens long before emergency services are ever called. It happens when a friend notices someone pulling away. It happens when a family member questions an unhealthy dynamic. It happens when society refuses to look the other way. As we close this examination of the Kelly Ann Bates case, honoring her memory and the tireless advocacy of her family, we must ask ourselves a vital question. In a world where the early warning signs of coercive control are often hidden in plain sight, how can we as individuals and communities become better equipped to recognize the quiet isolation of a victim and intervene before the invisible chains of abuse become unbreakable?